So, hi, my name's Summer May Finlay. I'm here at the University of Queensland for Croakey with Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, who is also a Commissioner at the Productivity Commission. And we're going to have a yarn about a report that's been recently released. But do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So, as you said, I'm a professor here at the University of Queensland, and I'm a Commissioner with the Queensland Productivity Commission, and was the presiding Commissioner in regards to what we're going to talk about today.
Yep, you're very busy.
I'm very busy, but really committed to the outcomes of the report in terms of that underlying key message of the report that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people need to be involved in and co-designing and making decisions around solutions for themselves in their own communities.
Fantastic. And this is the report here.
That's right. That's the summary report. There's also a final report. So the summary report is 34 pages. If people want to read that, it's more easy to read.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the key findings of the report?
So some of the key findings of the report included that across Queensland, across government departments and agencies, there's a really complex web or a complex system of policy design, funding, matrices or how things are funded, compliance, governance mechanisms and service delivery. And it kind of works like a really complex web and really hard to navigate, not just for people in community, but local government, NGOs, in some cases also government, and knowing what other government departments do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess all of us have used services at different point in time, and I think even as an individual, I've found, not in Queensland necessarily, New South Wales, that the services provision is very complex even there.
That's right, and the other thing with that, Summer, is we found all of that too about the complex system, but it also has resulted in, despite all of the monies and all of the dollars going into remote and discrete communities, that it has resulted in quite poor outcomes in a number of areas. And the other thing is that hasn't really addressed, or the reforms and reviews in the past haven't really addressed the underlying incentives, which actually seek in some ways or work counter and undermine some of the progress that could be made.
Can you give us an example of maybe one
of the... People or agencies could be rewarded or incentivised, or they get a compliance tick for having the number of beds in emergency housing, or the number of children addressed through not going to school, or the number of people in long-term unemployed programs versus the positive impacts of moving people on and addressing preventative health measures, or having children in school. And
Yeah, no, fantastic. So there's obviously a set of recommendations within the report. Who's actually responsible for implementing those recommendations?
That's a whole of government. In this case, it's about the Queensland government responsibility, considering the review. The inquiry looked at service provision in terms of funding from government. So it's about government, how government works with itself in terms of delivery, but also how government works with NGOs across Queensland, and businesses, local government, and also stakeholders, things like procurement of services and how that all happens in communities and programs. There's some referrals in terms of making an impact to what happens at the Commonwealth level, but be very clear, this is a state-based inquiry, so the recommendations speak directly to the state.
So it sounds like there's a lot of really big suggestions in here, and given that it's such a complex system and we're talking at a state level, how do you think these changes are actually going to be implemented? What's required?
The changes require real leadership, and it's not just I'm saying, I need leadership, and we often hear that, but leadership across government. Yeah. And what we see sometimes is that and it happens across different sectors. It's not just government, it happens in unis, it happens in business, where the Indigenous focus is often left to the Indigenous unit or the Indigenous department or the Indigenous staff. In this case, it can't be. It actually needs to be spread across government. The inquiry was looking at whole of government, all government. So it needs to be across not just one agency. There needs to be coordination. And I will say there does need to be a willingness, not just the will, but a willingness to do. And there needs to be a checking in by staff in government as well around, letting go. Yeah. And that's going to be a big challenge. Yeah. And there's going to be some challenges there for community too, about stepping up. Because if you want to control and you want to make decisions and you want to be, involved in the solution setting and designing, then that requires people to undertake some maybe skills development in some areas, but also step up in taking responsibility to sit at the tables and undertake what needs to happen.
Yeah, sounds like some massive changes there. Have there been any changes to date?
There's been some changes. Once we delivered the report to government, the government had 6 months to look at that report before it went public. So it did go public in June last year, that's June 2018. And since that time, there's been a range of meetings. There's been an interim committee set up. Currently now, in August, there is a call for expressions of interest to sit on the committee going forward in terms of assisting to direct some of that work going forward. But we still need to see greater change and greater roundtable meetings or discussions about how the implementation of the recommendations will happen.
What changes how do you think that this is going to impact communities?
I think there's things that need to be looked at in terms of real change and real changes over time. There's things that may be shorter term, but let's be clear, the systems that are in place in that complex web and around the capacity building and capability building of both government and community members, that's going to take a long time. That could take years and years. But having said that, it's not about to give up hope. We need to keep that hope and have the support mechanisms, and therefore there is a need for government, for people to think about this as long-term change. It's not short-term change, it's long-term change. And for communities to be able to be engaged in decision-making and enacting solutions, that is about long-term change.
Well, the long-term change is going to require bipartisanship, I would imagine. So throwing in a comment there that, we're talking about potential generations of change.
That's correct, and I think we need to think about how people in that space of that long-term change keep the work alive. How do people continue to quote the report, utilise the report for all it is? I mean, the report in developing that was about bringing all the evidence available, the literature, government data that was available, both Commonwealth and state data that was, and research undertaken by people in places like UQ and other universities, as well as having stakeholder meetings with communities, data from communities, public forums, submissions, and bringing all that together to provide a platform going forward. It can't be just easily dismissed, and people need to utilise the report in what it has, and also ask government how government is responding, and to support the implementation. And we as individuals also need to have the willingness.
Yep, absolutely. So there's got to be the accountability at all levels.
That's right, accountability. We did suggest in the put forward a recommendation that an independent monitoring mechanism be established, whether it was an agency or a process of having, clearinghouse of data or a way to be able to monitor what is happening, not just in the short term but in the longer term. So it would be great to see how that's going to happen. Absolutely. Because that's a way to measure the changes, not just short term but longer term, and also match those changes to, what are the real outcomes? In 5 years' time, do we see the same or slight increases or changes of funding, but what are the outcomes now as opposed to previous? And also, how does that measure up, in terms of 5 years or 10 years to the close the gap agendas? Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, without monitoring, we'll never know what our successes are either, as well as what we need to change as we're going along. Because often I know things get thrown out, baby gets thrown out with the bathwater because there's parts of a program that aren't working.
That's correct.
But we do need to know what is working and why, which is very important. Is there anything else you want to say about the report at all?
I think that people need to get on the QPC website and have a look at that. There's the final report, as I said, which is quite lengthy, and people can drill down to that. It does separate it out under chapters, so if people are interested specifically in health, or people are interested in evaluation, the evaluation chapter is quite relevant at the moment in terms of the National Productivity Commission's calling for submissions in terms of Indigenous evaluation and how that will happen at a national level. So there's components in that. But if you're time poor and want a quick read, please have a look at the summary report. And there's also lots of other documents, so people can read the individual submissions that were put on been uploaded. There's also the consultation paper that went out and all the other material that has been involved in the QPC report for remote and discrete Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities in Queensland.
And what do you think our Croakey readers and also people who follow us on Twitter can do to support you in the report?
People need to read the material. I'd love for Croakey readers to read the summary report and have a look at the material online, the final report if they've got time. I would love them to be able to talk up the report, to ask their, representatives of government what is happening with the report, and to really in their communities say, how does this fit in with some of the recommendations? How does this fit into what we said? If they're from a discrete or remote community, keep in mind that the Mayor's asked for this inquiry. Mm-hmm. This was not an inquiry that's come from the government. This was an inquiry that came from people lobbying around they want to change. So people need to drive this as well around saying, how does this meet what we want now in terms of what the government's putting forward, and keep it alive and have the willingness within oneself to step up and to make that happen, make things happen within communities for change, for better outcomes for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thanks, Summer.